Welcome, Dr. Judith Joseph. Welcome to Forward Joy.
Thank you for having me. It's so good to see you again.
Oh my, it's so good to see you. We met in what, 2022, I think, when I interviewed you for the Maybelline podcast that I was working on. And then you had me on your podcast, and now you're back on mine. So I'm really excited to dive into. You've had a book come out, which is very exciting, your first book.
Yes. First book, my book baby.
How exciting. Also, I feel like I have to tell everyone that you have like the coolest office. Can you tell the backstory behind it?
Well, you've seen it, but you only saw two labs. We opened a third lab, and the
Oh,
third lab, in the same space, is like purely psychedelic research. So things like psilocybin, ketamine, alternative ways to approach happiness.
yeah,
But they're not like, they're not off-label. We're highly regulated by the FDA, or else this would be illegal.
of course.
But it's a lab, a research lab. And I also see patients here in my private practice. That's a separate entity. And then I have a media business, and that's where you were on the podcast, and you walked into the vault, which is
Yes,
like
the
a real
vault.
diamond vault,
You
where I
have a
turned it into a podcast
diamond
studio.
vault in your office.
Yes, well, it's in the Diamond District, so most of the
Right.
offices in this building used to house like rare diamonds and gems. In fact, when I first moved in, there were like little shards of like diamond and gems on the floor. So the vault was there to protect the diamonds that that previous business owner had, and they couldn't remove it. So I took it and turned it into a place of mental wealth, my podcast studio, the vault.
It's so cool. You don't come across that very often in New York City and not in like a doctor slash like research facility. So it's a very unique space. So, I was going over your bio and everything before this, and you just have the most incredible resume. You did your undergrad at Duke, medical and business degrees from Columbia, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at NYU Langone Medical Center. Like these are all major names, and you lead research on high functioning depression and menopause related mental health issues and have done research for the FDA. Your research has garnered so much recognition, including a congressional proclamation from the US House of Representatives in 2023, which you're going to have to tell us what that means later. But first, I want to take it back to your childhood. What were you like as a kid?
As a child, I grew up with three other siblings, so there were four of us, and we
Mhm.
didn't have much. So when we came to this country from Trinidad, we lived in this tiny one bedroom apartment, the four kids and my mom, and my dad stayed behind in Trinidad to work and send us money because he's older than my mom. And
Mhm.
that was very common for a lot of Caribbean American families to have one
Yep.
family, one parent, going to get better opportunities while the other family member worked and took care of things at home. Very typical.
Mhm. Yep.
But
My
so
mom lived that as
typical.
well.
Yeah, your family's Jamaican. So
Mhm.
it's just because it's normal and typical doesn't mean it's not problematic or has issues, but we just everyone
Totally.
did it. So when I was missing my dad and I was having severe, attachment issues related to that, no one ever said, well, that's, you know, you should, feel like that. They were like, well, everybody does it. So it's kind of like what happens with women when women
Right.
have their periods. It's like, well, everyone gets their period. Why complain? Well, just because it happens to everyone doesn't mean it's not painful, right? But that was
Mhm.
how I was raised. And my mom was very strict. She didn't let us watch television. So instead of watching
Wow.
TV, we would come up with skits as siblings and play together and be,
Mm.
very creative together. So my childhood was, had a lot of positives and negatives, but my siblings really, shaped the way that I see myself in the world. And,
Mhm.
some people always feel alone. I never feel alone because I have my siblings and we're very, very close.
I love that. I have two older brothers that I'm quite close with as well. And yeah, I couldn't imagine doing life without them, even though they're actually significantly older than me.
Mm.
So there was a period of my childhood where I kind of was an only child because they weren't in the house. They graduated high school when I was like 8. 7 or 8 years old, but still just I would like write letters to them when they were at college and things like that. So
Oh, that's so
yeah, I
cute.
always kind of had that connection. I
So they must be
assume,
really protective of you. Like
oh,
nobody's enough.
oh,
Nobody's good enough for you.
oh, big time. Especially the younger of my two brothers. Like, he's all like, if anybody messed with me, all I had to do was tell him, and he would be like showing up at school and like intimidating people. So,
You know, we put a lot of worth on our parents, but we don't think enough about how our siblings shape us because like your brother, making you feel as if you were so important because he valued you probably shaped your self-worth. So like when you walk around in the world, people are like, "Oh, she feels good about herself." Like, I wish I were that confident. But a lot of it, people will think, "Oh, that's probably the way her parents raised her," which is not inaccurate, but also
right.
siblings,
Yeah,
they
I never
really shape the
actually,
way you view yourself.
yeah, I've actually never even thought about that before, in that context. And yeah, I think that's very true. I think, um, of course, like they're brothers, so they beat up on me and they made fun of me and all of those things. But I think at the end of the day, yeah, I could always feel that they were very protective of me. And as we've gotten older, it's like even though I'm the younger sister, like they always come to me for advice or come to me to tell me things, and I love that. But obviously, because you're from Trinidad, you have Caribbean parents. Was mental health ever something that was ever talked about in your house?
It's interesting. I was just speaking with someone about that today. Like, I remember growing up, there was a child in our community who, now when I look back, I'm like, oh, that was likely like neurodivergence. They probably were autistic.
Hmm.
But then growing up, it was like everyone would lay hands on them and pray. And I think back and I'm like, oh my gosh, that must have been so traumatizing for that person, right? They
Mm,
probably don't ever want to go to church
right.
because, like what they were experiencing because of neurodiversity was seen as like a spiritual matter and not a positive spiritual matter, like as if there was something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think about things like, a lot of times we would have people coming in with severe trauma. And as a child, I wouldn't know what their trauma was because that was like the adult matter. But if they expressed their trauma in a way that they were having like dissociation or like, feeling not attached to their body or like it looked as if they were hallucinating, they would
Mm,
be said to have had spirits or something like that. So, I remember mental health in not the most positive way growing up, but I do know that many people would like use the church to pray, to get a sense of community, to lean on, faith and a higher power to experience things that we classify as awe in psychology, like that awe of like, you're not here alone, you're here for a reason.
mm-hmm.
So there were elements of mental health. It just wasn't called mental health,
Oh,
growing
right.
up. There were
Mm-hmm.
positives and negatives to mental health in my community growing up. But I think things have changed because my dad, he's now very much more open to, like the more informed perspective of mental health and open to like things like medication and diagnoses and, things that before they didn't even talk about. So I think that has shifted, but it was very different from when I was growing up.
I can imagine. Yeah, there's also Caribbean people absolutely have something against like medicine, like traditional medicine and things like that. Like, yeah, even if my dad has a headache, I'm like, okay, well, why don't you take something for it? He's like, no, 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 I don't like to take those things. No. I'm like, okay, well then suffer.
Yeah, they're really like anti anything medicinal a lot of times. Like I think the older generations, but the way I frame it is like a lot of the meds we use came from like the rainforest. So,
Hmm.
pharmaceutical companies, because, I'm in that space, I
Hmm.
know that they get these meds from the earth. And so if you think about it that way, like if you believe in God and God created the earth and God created these plants and God
Hmm.
created man, then man uses, their science and their intelligence and creativity to use elements from the earth to, heal. And so
Yeah.
if you think about it that way, it's not very different from what you believe. Things like
Right.
lithium that I prescribe every day. Lithium is literally an element on the periodic table. It is
Mm.
literally an element from this earth. And in some places it's in the water. So, when I'm working with people who, let's say, have bipolar disorder, and I'm like, lithium is so natural. They love that because, like, if I were to say something else, they're like, oh, well, there's a lot of mistrust in pharma. But when you think
Yeah.
about it, this stuff comes from the earth. We're just using, our God-given skills
Mm-hmm.
to make them more accessible to the human
Accessible.
body, right?
Yeah. When did you start becoming curious about psychology?
Well, I actually started in medical school in a surgical field. When I wanted to be a doctor, the first doctor in my family, I had this very like beeline kind of like tunnel vision approach to it. I was like, I'm going to do something surgical, something that has to do with the brain. Initially, I was like doing a lot of neurosurgery research as an undergrad at Duke. And then when I
Mm-hmm.
went to Columbia, I thought maybe either something surgical, and I found myself in the operating room doing anesthesiology as a resident for 2 years. And
Mm-hmm.
at the time, it was super competitive. Like everybody wanted to be an anesthesiologist because they made a lot of money, they had a good schedule. Um, but when I was doing it, I found it very empty. I felt empty. Like I was like, I'm putting patients to sleep. It's a very important job. You're
Yeah.
not just putting them to sleep, you're keeping them alive as the surgeon's
Mm-hmm.
cutting them open. If you
Right.
think about it, the surgeon's like literally killing them.
Yeah.
And so I just felt like that's not why I went into medicine. I wanted to help
Mm-hmm.
people. I wanted to connect to people. And when I started to understand the science of my happiness, I grew up in this big family. We would go out into the community, we'd help others. Connection is what makes me happy. But I'm in a field where there's very little connection. I put a patient to sleep. The surgeons don't really talk to you other than table up, table down, more meds, less meds, wake the patient
Yeah.
up. So it just wasn't feeding me. Although on the outside, it looked very prestigious. Like people were like, wow, how did you get a spot at Columbia? That's like the most competitive program. And it's like, like you should be so lucky. And when I started to like say I didn't want to stay in the field, people were like, no, you're making a mistake. Just, trust us. In 2 years, you'll be done. And no one's happy in medicine. It's like, whoa, well, I don't want to be one of those. No one
Oh
is
boy.
happy in medicine. I want to feel fulfilled in the job and outside of the job. And
Yeah.
so I left, which was a huge risk. My parents were like, do not leave. That is a good job. Like, you're going to ruin your reputation. But I did it. I listened to my gut and I was like, I need to figure out how to use my skills in a way that I feel fulfilled and connected to people. And a friend of mine was actually in a residency at Cornell in psychiatry. And she was like, you should do psych because it's really good. It's like you get to talk to people, you help people. And she was like, you really enjoyed your psych rotation in South Africa when you were working with those orphans who had no parents and you were doing trauma informed work. You came back so happy. You should consider that. And I remembered that experience as being transformative because I was literally
Mm.
working with these little girls and we were in this group where we were sharing our stories and they were saying about how like they admired me because I was a doctor and like if I can do it, they can. And then I
Yeah.
shared with them that like I was like, I grew up really with very little resources and like I had parents. You don't have parents because the parents had died of AIDS. But I
Mm-hmm.
was like, I didn't have much. So if I can do it, you can too. And we were just crying together. And I was like, this is like
Oh.
the best part of my med school. Why it's unfair. This happened at the end. I had already matched in anesthesiology. So I often thought of those girls because
Oh.
they transform me. You think you're going in to save orphans, but you are surprised when you
Mm-hmm.
work with children who have been brought up in the most, um, sad conditions, like how they
Mm-hmm.
change you. They become the teacher, right? You learn that
Right.
if these children can find joy without a parent, without things, if they are able to find joy in just living, then they teach you that you don't really need much to be
Yeah.
happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up leaving anesthesiology and I was lucky enough to land in a spot at Columbia. They were looking for a psychiatrist because one of their residents had left for personal reasons. And
Mm-hmm.
I never looked back. It was so eye-opening. I learned about how people thought. I was like, when I was interacting with my patients, I was like, wow, that's why they do this. And like, why didn't I like, do this from the beginning? It's just so
Right.
fascinating. Um, and then and then they offered us therapy. They were like, if you're going to be treating patients, you need to be in therapy. And I was like,
Mm.
oh, I don't need to be in therapy. Like I'm off, I'm not crazy. Like this was me as like a naive psychiatry resident. I was like, I don't have schizophrenia. I'm like, fine. They were like,
Right.
oh no, this is so that you can unpack your own trauma. I don't have trauma. Whoa, was I wrong? Wow. Just because you don't acknowledge trauma doesn't mean you don't have it. So like the
Right.
brain suppresses it so that you don't think
Mm-hmm.
about it. But then when you don't acknowledge it, you don't see how it's impacting your behavior. So not only was psychiatry saving for me because it gave me a field that actually brought me purpose that I feel like I was destined to be in, but
Mm-hmm.
it saved me on a personal level because it allowed me to take down the mask of being perfect and examine like the past that I had never dealt with, that I was actually running from.
Mm.
And by being pathologically productive and excelling and being excellent, I was out trying to outrun a past that was actually quite painful for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to my work in high functioning depression.
That's so incredible. What was that journey like of being in therapy and like starting to unpack, your childhood and things that you've been through? Like, because obviously, as you said, like you were hesitant. So were you resistant to it for a while before things like started to click for you?
Yes, actually, I talk about this in my book a lot about how I like the program was like, essentially giving us this free therapy from these world-renowned psychoanalysts, like people
Mm-hmm.
who are like dressed to the nines with their like three-piece suit
Mm.
and their
Okay.
nice shoes and their nice like Upper East Side homes with like the Persian rug. It was like out of a movie. And here are these
I
like
love
broke
that.
residents coming in. And like the patients before us and after us were like clearly dripping with money and we're like broke residents. But it was just such out of like a movie. I often felt like I was like, why am I here? Like this guy can't get my problems. What does he know about me? I'm from Trinidad. I grew up in like an urban area. I
Hmm.
used scholarships all my life. I didn't have any money. What does this rich guy know about me? Boy, was I wrong. That rich guy knew so much. He just said the right things. And at one point he confronted me. He was like, "You are a masochist." And I explained what masochism is in the book. And he goes like, you have this opportunity to have this like incredible therapy and you're just like wasting it. Why? And I was like,
Oh, you got called out.
I
He called
did.
you out.
He did. And this is an old white man who I thought there's no way he could ever know
Right.
me. Well, he was an incredible and an incredibly skilled therapist. So me assuming that he didn't know me because he has a different background,
Hmm.
um, was like, first of all, wrong on my part, and also that was my personal defense mechanism for like not
Yeah.
wanting to engage in the therapy. But when
Hmm.
I finally, stopped being masochistic and depriving myself of like a experience that was transformative, I actually grew in the therapy and learned so much about me, about how my unresolved trauma was the reason that I overworked, that I was constantly collecting degrees, that I constantly felt like I had low self-worth, that I needed to
Hmm.
prove something, that I had to collect all these accolades in order to be appreciated, which is just like now that I know, it's like terrible. I tell my therapist, it's like you saved me from that JD because I would have collected a law
You would
degree.
you would have kept going. I know, right? Isn't that so fascinating how, I mean, obviously we live in a world where education is so important. I mean, maybe not in this current presidency, but has always traditionally been very important. And so you would look at someone like yourself who's very intelligent and striving to get all these degrees, and you're like, well, that's great. She's just ambitious and she's driven and she's going after everything that she wants. But somewhere underneath, there's something a bit more sinister that's driving that need for success.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I can't tell you, every time I go to these major corporations or these talks, I find exceptional Black women. I just, and like, I see them, they see me, and it's like, we know there's this like unspoken, like,
Right.
like
Hmm.
I know you're doing well and you're like the top of your game, but you are still working hard. You're still
Hmm.
proving yourself. And I think
Hmm.
that's the part of the understand the science of your happiness, because when you look at the biopsychosocial model in my book, biologically as Black women, we go through so much um, because our hormones are dysregulated at a different rate and severity as others. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of theories around that, but it's probably due to trauma.
Hmm.
And and also psychologically, again, we have higher rates of trauma. And socially, we have a lot of stressors, the microaggressions, and also like we don't
Hmm.
have the advantages and the opportunities and the pay. And also, there's just so much stress. And so from the biopsychosocial model, our happiness looks different because there's so many more barriers or different barriers in the way of our happiness. Whereas
Hmm.
if I look at a patient who's like a young man, biologically, he may be at risk for something like a dementia because it runs in his family. Psychologically, he may have attachment issues that stem
Hmm.
from his childhood. And then socially, he may have stressors, having to do with maybe overuse of substances. Over everyone has a different biopsychosocial, but the important thing is that we know that we're different. Why are we using tools that haven't been like tested in us? Why are we just like saying, oh, I'm gonna read this book, I'm gonna watch this podcast, I'm gonna do that? Well, that science does not apply to you. So if you find
Hmm.
yourself reading books, listening to things, and you're just like, well, I tried that, it didn't work, it's because you didn't understand the science of your happiness. So I want people to read this book, and anyone can, and then be like, oh, I understand the science of what's making me unhappy because I am unique. I'm the only one who will ever exist who like me in the future and the history of the universe. So let me understand the science of my happiness, and the science of my unhappiness, so I know how to actually use these tools to get the most out of it. But yeah, I see this all the time, and if when as Black women, when we understand the science of our happiness, then we know why we behave this way, and then we're able to change our
Right.
direction as a result.
Did you see other Black women as you were going through school? Or like, did you ever feel like you received pushback because you were a Black woman at these prestigious schools? Because as we know, DEI is, under attack. And we know even Elon Musk had made a comment sometime maybe last year about how, oh, if he got a Black doctor, he would think that the standards had been lowered for them, which is just truly one of the most vile things anybody could say.
I mean, I wish that he would actually go to a school and see who's there, because if you're looking at these schools, there are not many of us. So to assume that the few of us who are there because we didn't earn it is just like a huge assumption. It's actually the opposite. The ones who are able to be in the room tend to have to work harder to get there.
Hmm.
And
Of course.
you don't the DEI doesn't give you honors. DEI doesn't dish out degrees, but we're like the
No.
highest, uh, we are the most decorated group of individuals. Black women have accolades upon accolades. They don't just pass you because you are Black, right? And I think if people thought about that, they would think differently about, when they see a Black person, a Black woman in a position of power, what it took for them to be there. They had to be the very, very best. And yeah, throughout my training, and people assume that, oh, you're just here because they needed to fill a seat. But there was countless times when I would be sitting there next to someone, I have an A plus, they have a C minus, and they're just like, oh, you're gonna have it easier than me. And I'm like, really? Because DEI didn't earn me this A, right? But it's just this mindset that is so pervasive. Um, even if you're looking at the actual numbers, the test scores, they will
Right.
still say you got there for another reason. So I just don't even spend my effort there. I
Right.
learned a long time ago that you can't change people. You can only focus on yourself. So rather than even being in those discussions, I just excel. and that's, focus on me. And that's worked well for me. I'm not in the
Clearly.
business of changing minds
Right.
that don't matter to me.
Exactly. Absolutely. So let's talk about your book, High Functioning: Overcome Your Hidden Depression and Reclaim Your Joy. How did you decide to write this book?
In my research lab, I was seeing a lot of people with symptoms of depression,
Mm-hmm.
but then when we went down on the checklist, they were over-functioning or exceeding functioning. And so in
Mm,
order to meet criteria for clinical depression, you actually have to like lose functioning or be in significant distress. So I thought, well, there's something happening right now in physical health. Like
mm-hmm.
longevity science is experiencing this renaissance where it's like, don't wait for the cancer, prevent it. Don't wait for the heart attack, prevent it. Don't wait for the hip to be broken, prevent it with like HRT and all this menopause care. Why are we waiting for people to break down in mental health to do
Mm,
something? So why are we not a part of that whole bandwagon of prevention? Where's our renaissance? And I had that epiphany as I was doing these assessments in my lab. Like, why are we waiting for people to break down to help, to intervene? Why don't we prevent the breakdown? And that's where I thought there needs to be research in high functioning depression. There needs to be research on people who have these symptoms but are not breaking down. And we have to
mm-hmm.
figure out a way to prevent them from the breakdown. And
Yeah.
that's how this was born. And fortunately, I have a lab. A lot of people, when they have ideas, they're like, oh, I wish I could do a study on this and I wish I could do that. And how would I start? I do studies all day long. So it was like, let me write this protocol and let me just, I was like, there's no way that no one has ever done a study on this. And I searched and I wrote to the IRB and they did a search and they were like, no one has ever done a study on high functioning depression. I was like, well, we will be the first. And I wrote the study, submitted it to the IRB, got the consents. We have patients who are identified as having high functioning depression and enrolled them in the study. And then we submitted it at the end of last year and it was published earlier this year. It's the first study in the world on high functioning depression.
Oh,
And so the
incredible.
book is based off of the research. My hypothesis was that people are running from trauma. And in the PTSD research I've done over the years, one of the symptoms of trauma is avoidance. And people
Mm-hmm.
think of trauma as being, oh, like you have hypervigilance, you have flashbacks and nightmares, but there are like 30 symptoms of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
One of the symptoms of trauma in the CAPS-5, which is the gold assessment for combat veterans, but we've moved that assessment over to all trauma. One of those symptoms is avoidance. And so you could, yeah, avoid things, people, and places or situations, but also you can avoid by busying yourself so you don't ever deal with the pain. And one of the
Right.
other symptoms is low self-worth and internalized blame and shame. Well, if you don't process trauma and you're blaming yourself on an unconscious or conscious level, you're going to end up bending over backwards and doing things that you shouldn't be doing, like overworking, overextending yourself, robbing yourself of joy. One of the symptoms of trauma is what's called cognitive symptoms. So these are things like not thinking clearly or forgetting. Well, guess what? Many of us push down our trauma and don't want to deal with it. So we don't even remember our trauma. And that's why I put an
Yeah.
expansive trauma inventory in the book so people could try and identify past trauma that they don't even remember.
Mm-hmm.
And also, one of the symptoms of trauma is this like kind of like low ability to enjoy things, just not being excited about interests that you used to enjoy. It's in the CAPS-5. That's anhedonia. So anhedonia is,
Mm-hmm.
not feeling pleasure in things or joy in things that you once enjoyed. Like, let's say you used to really like seeing your friends, you'd rather not see them, stay home and watch, Netflix. Or you used to really like, eating sushi, and when you're eating it, it tastes blah. Or you like used to look forward to being intimate with your partner, and now you're just like, when is it going to be over? Like, these are the simple joys in life that are robbed when you have anhedonia. So I really wanted to make the research accessible to the real world because I felt like there was a huge disconnect. When a patient comes to my private practice, they'll say, Dr. Judith, I just want to be happy. But in research, where you will very rarely find that word happy on an assessment. What you will find are things that we measure called points of joy. So,
Mm.
for example, if you're tired and you rested, did you feel refreshed, right? That's a point. If you were really exhausted, were you able to feel less restless? That's a point. If you were feeling lonely and disconnected when you saw others, did you feel connected? Did you enjoy that interaction? That's a point. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all of these points that make up overall happiness. But when a patient comes in, they're like, I want to be happy. And I explain it as happy is an idea or an ideal, joy is an experience. It's all those things that I just described. And when patients think about it that way, they're like, oh my gosh, so I can get points every day. Like if today I get 2 points, tomorrow I get one, at least it's attainable versus happy. That idea of being happy, you may never get that. And then you feel like
Mm-hmm.
you failed and then you blame yourself.
Also, it's temporary.
Hmm. It is.
We can't feel happy 24/7. That's just impossible. And
Hmm.
yeah, the idea of chasing that is, I think, feels really overwhelming.
Yeah. And also it makes you less present because you're chasing an idea that's in the past. It's elusive. Versus
Mm-hmm.
if you're like, I'm going to try and get joy in as many moments. Joy could be like, okay, I'm thirsty. I'm going to take a sip of water, and it's going to
Mm-hmm.
quench my throat. And that was like actually very joyful. But we don't think about it that way because our phones tell us, well, joy is when you have the man and the car and the house and the perfect body, right? But
And
no, even
10,000
people with
likes
that, yes,
and a million
yes.
followers.
But even people who get that, they're still not happy. The
Of
science
course.
shows that you get those things that you think will make you happy, but you're still searching.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you sit at your desk and you eat your salad and you close your, laptop and you're actually tasting the almonds and the dressing and crunchy leaves,
Mm-hmm.
that is actually joy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. How can someone differentiate between high functioning depression and regular stress or burnout?
Burnout, which is an interesting term, was only put into the Bible of Psychiatry, the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, only recently.
Yeah.
But nobody would say that, oh, well, because it wasn't put in there, it didn't exist, right? It's always
Mm-hmm.
been there. Just like imposter syndrome, it's not in the DSM, but probably one day it will be, but we wouldn't say it didn't exist. But
Right.
burnout, by definition, in the way it was classified, has to do with occupational stress. So it's like the workplace that's doing it. So
Mm-hmm.
technically, once you're removed from that setting, your symptoms should resolve, right?
Mm-hmm.
But many of us, will be like, okay, if I just like take a break and like I go to a different country and I relax and I'll be fine. But the
Mm-hmm.
anhedonia chases them. It doesn't go away. The
Right.
symptoms don't leave them. They're still that way. And that's like a really easy way to know whether or not it's burnout or like a true depression, because like being removed from that situation that's stressful and toxic
Mm-hmm.
should actually help you feel better. But some
Right.
people leave it and they're still not better. They're actually finding other things to busy themselves. So that one is external, one is internal. The burnout is the external factor. Once that pressure is off the system, you should feel better.
Mm-hmm.
The high function depression is the internal, right? Even when you're removed from your work, you're still finding things to busy yourself. You're still overextending yourself with your kids. You're still taking on side hustles and projects. You are busying yourself with like cleaning up your house and doing all these things. You cannot sit still. You feel empty when you sit still. You feel restless when you're not busy. There's something about coping by doing that is soothing for you in the short term, but in the long run, it will have its impact on you either physically or mentally.
There's an element of self-sabotage that's involved in high functioning depression. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, there's a dirty word in psychiatry called masochistic
Mhm.
personality disorder. When people think of masochism, they think of like the sexual masochism. That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
They're actually like personality disorders that were in there at one point in time that were yanked out. And
Mm.
masochistic disorder is one of those that was yanked out in the 80s.
Mm.
And the reason it was yanked out was because it was being used, overly used, to classify women who were victims of domestic violence. So there were terms within masochistic personality disorder that were problematic, such as you incited violence or bad treatment onto yourself, right? So that's
Right.
victim blaming. But
Hmm.
there are other elements that I think probably we should have kept, like, people who tend to bend over backwards for others, people who tend to do for others, even though it's robbing them of joy, people who think that they're not worthy of happiness and pleasures.
Hmm.
So those things we see now, and I think one of the lay terms is people pleasing, right?
Yeah.
Um, and again, what if the theory of high functioning depression stems from trauma? One of the symptoms of trauma is internalizing shame and self-blame. So you don't feel worthy enough. So what do? You end up doing and pleasing and bending yourself over backwards and working and overdoing, and you can't sit still. You always have to be in this role. You've kind of forgotten who you were. Um, and so people pleasing and masochism are things I talk about in the book, as well
Hmm.
as trauma and anhedonia. And when you take the people pleasing quiz and you identify these problematic elements of behavior, then hopefully you'll say, okay, I really have to make sure that I limit that type of behavior because it's only worsening things for me. But you're absolutely right. That is an element of high functioning depression.
So let's break down the path to healing this high functioning depression. You came up with a system that's called the 5 V's.
Yeah.
So can you take us through them?
Well, a lot of times people with high functioning depression don't acknowledge how they feel. And it could be
Hmm.
because they're running from trauma or they just weren't raised in a household where people talked about feelings. Whatever it is, they just have a hard time with that. So what do? Instead, they push through pain. Validation is accepting how you feel, naming it, so acknowledging it. And this is scientifically based. There's something called affect labeling, where if you are able to name the feeling and identify it, that actually is therapeutic in itself. Why?
Totally.
Because the human brain doesn't like uncertainty. And we all know that uncertainty is stressful. Like, look at what happened with 2020. We didn't know what was going to happen the next day, the next week, the next month, and it really drove us crazy. So
Hmm.
being able to name your and accept your feeling is so powerful. And I have different tools for people to validate. That's why I use rating scales because having a number that says, "Oh wow, I did have trauma. Oh, oh, my anhedonia score is this high." That's a form of validation, right? The second V of the 5 V's is venting. This is expressing how you feel, and people can express their emotions differently depending on how you were raised and how, your industry. I have a lot of clients who are performers and they like to sing their feelings or wear their feelings with
Hmm.
fashion. Others like to write about, their what they're going through, but
That's
some
me.
some like to talk about it. In my Caribbean household, prayer is essential for my father and his generation.
Hmm.
But also like crying for little kids. You see them crying, and that's okay. Now we know that it's okay to cry. You're not like a little baby. It's really an important way to express your emotions. And
Yeah.
then values is the third V. These are things that don't have price tags. These are things that are priceless. So what are the
Hmm.
things that give you meaning and purpose in life? And for many people with high functioning depression, it's like the accolades. They're chasing the clout, but really the things that they want to tap into to leave them feeling full and fed spiritually are things like
Hmm.
a cause, their community, their families, their faith, um, things like nature. Like that's something that is a lasting value. And then the fourth V is vitals. And these are the things that help to support your body and brain because you only get one of them. So, your doctor will tell you about, the typical things like eating foods that are not processed, that don't cause inflammation, getting good movement in to boost the endorphins, getting, having good sleep and, healthy sleep hygiene. But then I added three non-traditional values, vitals in there. So one, your relationship with technology, because there will be a whole host of conditions in the future related to tech use. Two, your relationships with people, because the
Hmm.
longevity science is now showing that your quality of your relationships, healthy and unhealthy, can be the most important predictor of your health and your longevity, and
Correct.
also your work-life balance, because with high functioning depression, we tend to have a hard time with that. So I put in some non-traditional vitals in there. And then
Hmm.
the fifth V is vision. How do you plan joy in the future so you keep moving forward
Oh,
instead of getting stuck in the past and
yeah.
celebrating your wins. And these are like the 5 V's. I don't recommend doing all five at once. Don't be high
Right.
functioning AF. Tap
Right.
into one or
It's a
two a
ladder. It's a
day.
ladder,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes. Tap into one or two a day. And I give you guidelines in the book as to which ones to tap into when. Science says you can't really do more than one or two things anyway, because then you get overwhelmed. But the whole purpose is to try and get, some points of joy every day. Like
Hmm.
when you're building up these points and you're adding them up, that is going to overall make you a happier person.
I love that because you're kind of like gamifying
Yes.
joy in a sense.
Yes, exactly.
Do you think high functioning depression is more prevalent in certain professions or personality types?
Well, we did the first study in the world. There has to be more studies, but personally, I do. I think anyone who's a caregiver, the study did show that caregivers had a higher rate of anhedonia.
Mm,
Caregivers are people who are like, you know, parents, mothers,
right.
people who take care of elderly folks in their lives, people who take care of those who are disabled, people who care for patients, you know, people who
Yeah.
take care of those who are dependent on them, like educators, like if you think of the person who's bending over backwards and can't afford to slow down, they're at risk.
Yeah.
Think of the
That was my,
entrepreneur. Yeah.
I was going to say that's my mom because she is a nurse and worked in
Mm.
geriatric care, and caregiving is just central to her nature.
Yes. And so what happens is that you tie that into your role and then you forget who you were before that and you
Hmm.
just keep doing it and you don't think about yourself. So you can't afford to break down because people depend on you and it's a vicious cycle. So I think they're definitely at risk.
Social media often glorifies like the grind and nonstop working and achievement, and pushing through our struggles. How do you see this influencing high functioning depression?
I think when people see this, they think, oh, so do you want us to just not function? And it's like, no, two things can't be true.
Right,
Like slowing down is not the same as not functioning.
right.
Slowing down and taking care of your basic human needs, you're a human being, not a human doing. That is what life is all about, right? Like we were built with the DNA for joy. We have it like that's why I use the five V's because it's like five fingers. You can easily remember it. Like to tap into your basic human, DNA to find joy. That's why we have the capacity to make dopamine. We're supposed to be finding joy. You don't have to teach a child to be joyful. You put a toddler on the floor and give them a box and a spoon, they'll play.
Right.
Um, you know, but along the way, we become so wrapped up in our role, we don't process our trauma and we forget how to access joy. And this is your way to access joy again. It's important to do that. But in order to do that, you first have to understand the science of your happiness.
Mhm. So obviously you turned the study into a fantastic book. Will you continue to do research on this?
We're still enrolling patients. The study that was published was based off of 120 patients, but we're trying to
Hmm.
get to double that number, hopefully. So the study's still going on, and our future work, because I have like the lab where I do studies on new treatments, but then I have the happiness lab where I do, work specifically researching joy. So we have one protocol coming up on music and how different musics can be like healing, rhythms can
So
heal.
healing.
And we have another one coming up with childhood play, how to
Mm.
teach children to play using their hands versus digital technology.
Right.
So that's the Happiness Lab has many more protocols to come. We're just getting started.
So exciting. Um, I also wanted to circle back to the congressional proclamation that you received. What was that for?
I got a call when I was in the UK. I got a call and they were like, "We need you to come to Washington because there's going to be a party with the vice president at the time it was Kamala Harris." And I was like, okay, am I in trouble? It was all very and it turned out they wanted to, it was like the first ever Caribbean American Heritage Month celebration at the White House. And I got an award for my social media advocacy and my research in mental health. And I guess they had seen the content that I was creating
Mm-hmm.
And I was making a lot of content around like, Caribbean mental health and no one was
Yes.
doing it at the time. And so they were like, oh my gosh, we need this in our community. And like, you're the only one doing it. So please let's award you for this. And then that turned it into a relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus and other members of Congress to do a lot of advocacy work in the Caribbean American community having to do with mental health. I got invited last year to film the first ever congressional recording on the state of Caribbean American mental health, and that you can find that on YouTube. It's myself and Congresswoman Sheila Shafilus McCormick, and she interviewed me about like ways that Caribbean Americans can think about their mental health, and so it feels as if it's their own. And I said during that, I said mental health has always been ours. Like, we walk by the ocean, that's our mental health, that's our
Mm-hmm.
mindfulness. We eat our curry chicken and our roti. That is that anti-inflammatory right there. We dance, we do our whining, that's our bilateral stimulation. We just call it something else. We pray,
Right. We just
we have
don't
our
know.
community.
They just
Yes.
don't really know that the impact that it's having on the
Yes.
mental health. But those things, yeah, there's so many things that are built into the culture that is really centered on joy.
It is. And it's mental health. We just called it something different. So it's like whenever
Hmm.
you think, oh, that mental health is someone else, that's American thing. No, we've
No.
always had it. And look, and I've traveled the world and even in India, when people are meditating and they're talking about the ego, I'm like, oh, they're talking about narcissism, how to not be a narcissist. Like
Hmm.
there are elements, we just call it different things, but we all
Right.
have mental health. It is ours. We just forgot about that. So we all have it. We just have to honor it. And we honor it differently. It
Hmm.
has to feel authentic to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Final question. What's bringing you joy right now?
It's always going to be connection. I went through this period in my life where I was like, I need to be happy on my own. And I was just like, why am I kidding myself? Like I grew up in a family that we
Hmm.
were all on top of each other. Like I don't like this is how I've derived joy. I have to be connected.
Yeah.
I learned that early in my career. I started to practice by myself and then I was like lonely and I was like, I want a team. I want to work in a team. So I said, I'm going
Hmm.
to start a research lab where I have a team that I see every day that I work with, you know,
Mm.
and and it's validating for me to have that research that shows that's out of Harvard that shows relationships are the predictor of your happiness is like, well, I need to be connected. Someone else
Yeah.
is like, oh, I'm fine with my me time. I love to be around people.
Hmm.
And so being around my family, my team, my daughter, all that connection, that for me is literally pure joy. And I had to learn the science of my happiness and stop fighting it and
Right.
embrace it. And now I know
Yeah.
how to be happy.
I love it. Dr. Judith, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for your excellence, your Black excellence, and all your research and all that you're doing to make the world a better place.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your warmth and your excellent questions. It's always great to see you.
Always.